You've probably heard of Confucius, after all, who hasn't? And he is clearly one of the major thinkers, even if interpreted in many, many, many different ways, that are at the foundation of China as a civilization state. And in this video, I'm going to introduce you to a modern English language translation of Confucius and a brilliant portrait of Confucius himself by a scholar that brings the thinking to life and also brings the connection of Confucianism to Chinese history to life. And it is part of a series I'm doing on the history of China. Over at my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, I've been doing a world history tour of the 5 major world powers of the current world: China, the United States, India, Russia, and Europe. And I've just completed the China leg of the tour. It is so important to understand China. Klaus Muhlhahn, the German historian who's written the modern textbook, if you like, on the making of modern China, wrote, "The rise of China in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is undoubtedly one of the greatest developments remaking the world we live in." And for that reason, I've taken a deep dive into Klaus Muhlhahn's book, which you can enjoy by becoming a paid subscriber over at jeffrich.substack.com. Making sense of the rise of China is so central to making sense of the geopolitics of the world today, of the day-to-day experience we are all having today, making sense of the current trade war between the United States and China. You can check the complete playlist of the China History World Tour at the end of this video. Why not sign up to jeffrich.substack.com? And here then is my reflections on Confucius by the great Australian scholar Simon Leys, also known as, in his real name was Pierre Ryckmans, and his masterly essay on Confucius. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome everyone, this is Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive, and welcome to my voiceover of an introduction to Confucius, including mini audiobook Pierre Ryckmans' classic essay on the Analects. If you're listening on the podcast, you can read this post in full at jeffrich.substack.com, where you can also become a paid subscriber for $5 US a month or $50 US a year and support my work, as well as getting deep dives, history guides, and slow reads. And there is a slow read contained in this week's post. In addition to the post, I'll be reading Pierre Ryckmans' classic essay on the Analects. Last week's history book recommendation, Linda Javan, The Shortest History of China, provided a snapshot of the thinker who is most associated with the Chinese civilization state, Confucius. Confucius, or Kongzi, Master Kong, was born in 551 BCE, before the contemporary era. He idealised education and the junzi, the educated or cultivated man, as the best guide to social harmony. He wandered China preaching philosophies for wise rule, but no rulers wanted him. Instead, his followers assembled his teachings into posthumous writings, including the aphorisms in the Analects, considered one of the foundational texts of Chinese civilization. Javan commented that the meaning of these texts has been debated for millennia. Such is life for foundational texts. In my deep dive this week, How Modern China Began in Qing Institutions, part 1 of a deep dive into Klaus Muhan, Making China Modern, I shared how those texts were debated by Neo-Confucians and other schools during the Tang, Ming and Qing dynasties, including during the Chinese Enlightenment. The meaning of Confucius may be disputed, but the influence of the ideas gathered under his name is not. Javan quotes the scholar Pierre Ryckmans on that civilizational influence. No book in the entire history of the world has exerted over a longer period of time a greater influence on a larger number of people than this slim little volume. That's from Pierre Ryckmans' foreword in Confucius, the Analects. Ryckmans' translation of the Analects has become a modern classic. His foreword to the translation has become a classic historical essay on Confucius. For that reason, I have chosen this essay as my classic essay mini audiobook on the China leg of the world tour. Ryckmans' essay has become a classic because he was both an idiosyncratic thinker and an exemplary essayist. His essays were gathered into a collection, The Halls of Uselessness, Collected Essays 2012. The collected essays are gathered like a Borgesian scholarly list into these parts: quixotism, literature, China, the sea, university, and marginalia. He belongs to my small canon of undefinable writers who cross genres and belong to no schools of thought. Before I read to you his classic essay, An Introduction to Confucius, let me introduce this legend of sinology. And there's a footnote to where you can find out more in the post. When he died in 2014, there were obituaries across the Australian media. He was an inspirational teacher with a legendary master of Chinese and a passionate love of traditional Chinese art and literature. But he was also a literary intellectual and great essayist. A jealous American academic once described him as a, quote, Western avatar of the former ruling class of Chinese men of letters whose aesthetic ideals he obviously shared. Ryckmans embraced the insult. He taught at ANU until 1994, so for a few years we trod the same grounds. But we did not meet. More significantly, he supervised the honours thesis of former Prime Minister of Australia and current Australian Ambassador to the USA, Kevin Rudd. Unfortunately, Ryckmans' grace did not transmit to Rudd. By the time Ryckmans retired as an academic, the modern university experience had disappointed his gentleman scholar ideals. The university had become, he said, and this is, quote, a bazaar where 1,000 wares are spread haphazardly while the scholars themselves are turned into peddlers, touts and pimps, desperately competing to hustle for a few more suckers. If we put aside the bitter sneer at suckers, Ryckmans was inspired by an ideal of the life of the mind. He sought to navigate the mysteries of truth, quote, irrespective of the consequences, implications and utility of this endeavour. He articulated this ideal in his essay, An Introduction to Confucius. The essay presents a more mysterious version of Master Kong than many Chinese and Western accounts. I am no sinologist and cannot claim Ryckmans presents the most authoritative view, but It is one of the most beautifully written. It is a step up from most accounts of Chinese civilization available in popular media, especially in relation to world politics and the US struggle to prevail as hegemon over autocratic China. Autocratic, of course, in quotation marks. A common stereotyped version of Confucian ideas is that they are the source of Chinese authoritarianism at home and abroad, for good or ill. In the field of international relations, mostly defined by USA scholars, a distorted image of Confucian ideas has prevailed. These Western ideas of Asian world order assume that China wants to be the Confucian authoritarian master of the world. This distorted view was doctrinally expressed in Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, and the remaking of world order. He presented a model of Sinic civilization that preferred a hierarchical model of society, both domestic and international, symbolised by the tribute system and the Middle Kingdom. Huntington used this concept to undercut arguments for a multipolar world even back in 1994. He wrote that because of their Confucian bias to authoritarianism, quote, the Chinese have not been sympathetic to, Huntington's quotes, multipolar or even multilateral concepts of security. China may profess harmony, diplomacy, peace, and shared development, but they have not learned the hard lessons of greater European wars. And there's a link to my post on the concept of greater Europe, including Russia, Europe, and North America in the post. Quoting Huntington, the Confucian ideal of world order was, of course, never fully realised in practice. Nonetheless, the Asian hierarchy of power model of international politics contrasts dramatically with the European balance of power model. By means of Confucius, pro-American international relations scholars have revived the old trope of Asiatic despotism to justify America's partition of Eurasia, or, as they would say, the liberal rules-based order. This week's deep dive into Muhan Making China model explores the real idea of world order professed during the Qing dynasty in more detail. Ryckmans offers a more complex portrait. He reads Confucius as a complex literary thinker formed through a collective tradition. He does not fit this rounded peg into the square hole of geopolitical analysis. He avoids the dull tropes of international relations. He finds the more vital source of Master Kong's imagination. By listening to this version of Confucianism, you can reimagine China's role in world history. Ryckmans begins his essay with Lu Xun, 1881 to 1936, the modernist master of Chinese literature, loved by all sides, to whom I will return to later in the China World History Tour. Listen on for my reading of the main sections of An Introduction to Confucius from Simon Leys, Pierre Ryckmans, The Halls of Uselessness. And I will begin the reading of An Introduction to Confucius now. And do consider becoming a paid subscriber to my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com, where you can get slow reads like this, deep dives, like my deep dive into Klaus Muhan's Making China Modern, and guides to history and world affairs today, like my guide to the post-1945 world, which everyone is talking about ending at the moment with the China-US trade war. Okay, let's listen to Pierre Ryckmans' classic history essay, An Introduction to Confucius. Lu Xun, who is rightly considered to be the greatest writer of modern China, he died in 1936 and, by the way, strongly disliked Confucius for reasons that will be noted in a moment, observed that whenever a truly original genius appears in this world, people immediately endeavour to get rid of him. To this end, they have two methods. The first one is suppression. They isolate him, they starve him, they surround him with silence, they bury him alive. If this does not work, they adopt the second method, which is much more radical and dreadful: exaltation. They put him on a pedestal and turn him into a god. The irony, of course, is that Lu Xun himself was subjected to both treatments. When he was alive, the communist commissars bullied him. Once he was dead, they worshipped him as their holiest cultural icon. But this is another story. For more than 2,000 years, Chinese emperors have set and promoted the official cult of Confucius. It became a sort of state religion. Now the emperors have gone, or have they? But the cult seems very much alive. As recently as October 1994, the communist authorities in Peking sponsored a huge symposium to celebrate the 2545th anniversary of Confucius's birth. The main guest speaker was the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. He was invited, apparently, because his hosts wished to learn from him the magic recipe, supposedly found in Confucius, for marrying authoritarian politics with capitalist prosperity. Karl Marx once warned over-enthusiastic followers that he was not a Marxist. With better reason, one should say that Confucius was certainly not a Confucianist. Imperial Confucianism only extolled those statements from the master that prescribed submission to the established authorities, whereas more essential notions were conveniently ignored, such as the precepts of social justice, political dissent, and the moral duty of intellectuals to criticise the ruler, even at the risk of their lives, when he was abusing his power or when he oppressed the people. As a result of these ideological manipulations, in modern times, many enlightened and progressive-minded Chinese came spontaneously to associate the very name of Confucius with feudal tyranny. His doctrines became synonymous with obscurantism and oppression. All the great revolutionary movements in 20th century China were staunchly anti-Confucian, and it is easy enough to sympathise with them. Moreover, if I may invoke here a personal experience, I still remember the dismay expressed by various Chinese friends on learning that I was translating the Analects of Confucius. They wondered how I could suddenly sink into that sort of intellectual and political regression. I certainly feel no need to justify the orientation taken by my work, yet such a justification would be all too easy to provide, for an obvious reason. No book in the entire history of the world has exerted, over a longer period of time, a greater influence on a larger number of people than this slim volume. With its affirmation of humanist ethics and of the universal brotherhood of man, it inspired all the nations of Eastern Asia and became the spiritual cornerstone of the most populist and oldest living civilization on earth. If we do not read this book, if we do not appreciate how it was understood through the ages, and also how it was misunderstood, how it was used, and how it was misused, in one word, if we ignore this book, we are missing the single most important key that can give us access to the Chinese world. And whoever remains ignorant of this civilization, in the end, can only reach a limited understanding of the human experience. This consideration alone would more than justify our interest in Confucius, even if he should have been every bit as distasteful a character as so many leading Chinese intellectuals portrayed him as being earlier in this century. Of course, that's the 20th century. Whether he was such is not for me to say. Confucius can speak for himself, and the marvellous fact is precisely that across 25 centuries, it seems at times he is directly addressing the very problems of our age and of our society. But this modernity of Confucius is an aspect which paradoxically non-Chinese readers may be in a better position to appreciate. The only advantage that can be derived from our status as ignorant foreigners is precisely the possibility of looking with a kind of unbiased innocence at this book, as if it were all fresh and new. Such innocence is denied to native readers. For them, the Analects is the classic par excellence. And before proceeding further, we should first briefly consider what is implied by the notion of a classic. The nature of a classic. A classic is essentially a text that is open-ended, in the sense that it lends itself constantly to new developments, new commentaries, different interpretations. With the passing of time, these commentaries, interpretations and glosses form a series of layers, deposits, accretions, alluvions, which accumulate, accrue, superimpose on one another, like the sands and sediments of a silting river. A classic allows for countless uses and misuses, understandings and misunderstandings. It is a text that keeps growing. It can be deformed, it can be enriched, and yet it retains its core identity, even if its original shape cannot be fully retrieved anymore. In an interview, Jorge Luis Borges once said, quote, "Readers create anew the books they read. Shakespeare is more rich today than when he wrote. Cervantes to Cervantes was enriched by Unamuno. Shakespeare was enriched by Coleridge, by Bradley. That's how a writer grows. After his death, he continues to develop in the minds of his readers. And the Bible, for instance, today is richer than when its various parts were first written. A book benefits from the passing of time. Everything can be of benefit to it. Even misunderstandings may help an author. Everything helps, even readers' ignorance or carelessness. After you have read a book, you may retain an inaccurate impression of it, but this means that it is being amended by your memory. That happens often to me. Caramba! I don't know whether I dare to confess this, but whenever I quote Shakespeare, I realise that I have improved on him." It's the end of Borges' quote. In a sense, if I may use such a trivial image, the way in which every statement in a classic can gather the comments of posterity may be compared to a hook or a peg on the wall of a cloakroom. Successive users of the cloakroom come one after the other and hang on the peg hats, coats, umbrellas, bags, and whatnot. The load swells up, heavy, colourful, diversified, and eventually the hook disappears entirely under it. For the native reader, the classic is intricate and crowded. It is a place filled with people and voices and things and memories, vibrating with echoes. For the foreign reader, on the contrary, the classic often presents the forlorn aspect of the cloakroom after hours, an empty room with mere rows of bare hooks on a blank wall. And this extreme austerity, this stark and disconcerting simplicity, accounts in part for the paradoxical impression of modernity, in italics, which he is more likely to experience. There's then a section on the Analects and the Gospels, which I'm going to skip over in this reading. And then we come to the section, Who was Confucius? Having noted why and how a novelist could perceive an essential aspect of the Gospels which a scholar had failed to grasp, it is time now to return to Confucius. There is naturally no need to defend his historical existence. It was never put into question, but any reader of the Analects ought certainly to develop the sort of sensitivity that Grach displayed in his reading of the Gospels and become similarly attuned to Confucius's unique voice. The strong and complex individuality of the master is the very backbone of the book and defines its unity. Elias Canetti, to whom I shall return later, summed it up neatly. The Analects of Confucius are the oldest complete intellectual and spiritual portrait of a man. It strikes one as a modern book. Traditional historiography tells us that Confucius was born in 551 and died in 479 BC. These dates may not be accurate, but modern scholarship has nothing better to offer. Over the centuries, the official Confucian cult has created a conventional image of the master, and as a result, many people have tended to imagine him as a solemn old preacher, always proper, a bit pompous, slightly boring, one of those men who push moderation too far. In refreshing contrast with these common stereotypes, the Analects reveals a living Confucius who constantly surprises. In one passage, for instance, the master provides an intriguing self-portrait. The governor of a certain town had asked one of the disciples what sort of man Confucius was, and the disciple did not know how to reply, which provoked Confucius's reaction. Why did you not simply tell him that Confucius is a man driven by so much passion that in his enthusiasm he often forgets to eat and remains unaware of the onsets of old age? That Confucius should have chosen enthusiasm as the main defining aspect of his character is revealing, and is further confirmed by other episodes and statements in the Analects. For example, after Confucius listened to a rare piece of ancient music, we are told the emotion took him by surprise. For 3 months, he forgot the taste of meat. Elsewhere, he stated that love and ecstasy were superior forms of knowledge. On various occasions, he could also upset and shock his entourage. When his beloved disciple Yan Hui died prematurely, Confucius was devastated. His grief was wild. He cried with a violence that stunned people around him. They objected that such an excessive reaction did not befit a sage, a criticism which Confucius rejected indignantly. In contrast with the idealised image of the traditional scholar, frail and delicate, living among the books, the Analects shows that Confucius was adept at outdoor activities. He was an accomplished sportsman. He was expert at handling horses. He practiced archery. He was fond of hunting and fishing. He was a bold and tireless traveller in a time when travel was a difficult and hazardous adventure. He was constantly moving from country to country. Pre-imperial China was a mosaic of autonomous states speaking different dialects but sharing a common culture, a situation somewhat comparable with that of modern Europe. At times he was in great physical danger and narrowly escaped ambushes set by his political enemies. Once in despair at his lack of success in trying to convert the civilized world to his ways, he contemplated going abroad and settling among the barbarians. On another occasion, he toyed with the idea of sailing away on a seagoing raft, such as were used in his time for ocean voyages. This daring plan was to puzzle to no end the less adventurous scholars of later ages. Confucius was a man of action, audacious and heroic, but ultimately he was also a tragic figure. This has perhaps not been sufficiently perceived. The fundamental misconception that developed regarding Confucius is summed up by the label under which Imperial China undertook to worship him, and at the same time to neutralize the subversive potential originally contained in his political message. For 2,000 years, Confucius was canonized as China's first and supreme teacher. His birthday, 28 September, is still celebrated as Teachers' Day in China. This is a cruel irony. Of course, Confucius devoted much attention to education, but he never considered teaching his first and real calling. His true vocation was politics. He had a mystical faith in his political mission. Confucius lived in a period of historical transition in an age of acute cultural crisis. In one fundamental respect, there was a certain similarity between his time and ours. In italics, he was witnessing the collapse of civilization. He saw his world sinking into violence and barbarity. 500 years before him, a universal feudal order had been established, unifying the entire civilized world. This was the achievement of one of China's greatest cultural heroes, the Duke of Zhao. But now the Zhao tradition was no longer operative. The Zhao world was falling apart. Confucius believed that heaven had chosen him to become the spiritual heir to the Duke of Zhao, and that he should revive his grand design, restore the world order on a new ethical basis, and salvage the entire civilization. The Analects is suffused with the unshakable belief Confucius had in his heavenly mission. He constantly prepared for it. In fact, the recruitment and training of his disciples was part of his political plan. He spent virtually his entire life wandering from state to state in the hope of finding an enlightened ruler who would at last give him a chance and employ him and his team who would entrust him with a territory, however small, where he might establish a model government. All his efforts were in vain. The problem was not that he was politically ineffectual or impractical. On the contrary, the elite of his disciples had superior competences and talents, and they formed around him a sort of shadow cabinet. There was a specialist in foreign affairs and diplomacy. There were experts in finance, administration, and defence. With such a team, Confucius presented a formidable challenge to the established authorities. Dukes and princes felt incapable of performing up to his standards, and their respective ministers knew that. Should Confucius and his disciples ever get a foothold at court, they themselves would quickly be without employment. Wherever he went, Confucius was usually received with much respect and formal courtesy at first. In practice, however, not only did he find no political opening, but cabals eventually forced him to leave. Sometimes even local hostility swiftly developed, and quite literally he had to run for his life. Early in his career, Confucius had once briefly been in office at a fairly low level. After that, never again in his life was he to occupy any official position. From this point of view, one may truly say that Confucius's career was a total and colossal failure. An admiring posterity of disciples were reluctant to contemplate this stark reality. The humiliating failure of a spiritual leader is always a most disturbing paradox which the ordinary faithful cannot easily come to terms with. Consider again the case of Jesus. It took 300 years before Christians became able to confront the image of the cross. Thus, the tragic reality of Confucius as failed politician was replaced by a glorious myth of Confucius, the supreme teacher. Then there are sections in the essay on the politics of Confucius and the education, and Confucius on education, which are wonderful. And if you get Simon Leys, Pierre Ryckmans, The Halls of Uselessness, you can read it in full. But I'm going to skip to the final section of the essay, The Silences of Confucius. In the short essay he wrote on Confucius, Elias Canetti, whom I quoted earlier, made a point that had escaped most scholars. He observed that the Analects is a book which is important not only for what it says, but also for what it does not say. This remark is illuminating. Indeed, the Analects make a most significant use of the unsaid, which is also a characteristic resource of the Chinese mind. It was eventually to find some of its most expressive applications in the field of aesthetics, the use of silence in music, the use of void in painting, the use of empty spaces in architecture. Confucius distrusted eloquence. He despised glib talkers. He hated clever word games. For him, it would seem that an agile tongue must reflect a shallow mind. As reflection runs deeper, silence develops. Confucius observed that his favourite disciple used to say so little that at times one could have wondered if he was not an idiot. To another disciple who had asked him about the supreme virtue of humanity, Confucius replied characteristically, "He who possesses the supreme virtue of humanity is reluctant to speak." The essential is beyond words. All that can be said is superfluous. Therefore, a disciple remarked, "We can hear and gather our master's teachings in matters of knowledge and culture, but it is impossible to make him speak on the ultimate nature of things or on the will of heaven." This silence reflected no indifference or skepticism regarding the will of heaven. We know from many passages in the Analects that Confucius regarded it as the supreme guide of his life. But Confucius would have subscribed to Wittgenstein's famous conclusion, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." He did not deny the reality of what is beyond words. He merely warned against the foolishness of attempting to reach it with words. His silence was an affirmation. There is a realm about which one can say nothing. Confucius's silences occurred essentially when his interlocutors tried to draw him into the question of the afterlife. This attitude has often led commentators to conclude that Confucius was an agnostic. Such a conclusion seems to me very shallow. Consider this famous passage. Zilu asked about death. The master said, "You do not know life. How could you know death?" Canetti added this comment, "I know of no sages who took death as seriously as Confucius. Refusal to answer is not a way of evading the issue, but on the contrary, it is its most forceful affirmation. For questions about death, in fact, always refer to a time after death. Any answer leaps past death, conjuring away both death and its incomprehensibility. If there is something afterwards, as there was something before, then death loses some of its weight." Confucius refuses to play along with this most unworthy legerdemain. Like the empty space in a painting, which concentrates and radiates all the inner energy of the painting, Confucius's silence is not a withdrawal or an escape. It leads to a deeper and closer engagement with life and reality. Near the end of his career, Confucius said one day to his disciples, "I wish to speak no more." The disciples were perplexed. "But Master, if you do not speak, how will little ones like us still be able to hand down any teachings?" Confucius replied, "Does heaven speak? Yet the 4 seasons follow their course, and the 100 creatures continue to be born. Does heaven speak? I have certainly spoken too much." Dated 1997. I hope you've enjoyed listening to those main excerpts from Simon Leys, Pierre Ryckmans' essay, An Introduction to Confucius, originally published with his translation of the Analects and extended in 1997. And thank you so much for listening to The Burning Archive, and do please consider becoming a paid subscriber of The Burning Archive to get all of my deep dives, slow reads, and guides to world history, world culture, and world affairs at Jeff Rich, JEFFRICH.substack.com. Bye now.